in this. Clearly, God has ultimacy in the actions they do. They are guilty and deserving of judgment. God is praiseworthy for righteous action that he performs through them. Okay, the last example I have here is the cross of Christ, which is such a clear example of compatibilism and the priority of God's action through wicked men. Acts 2, Peter says in 2:23, referring to Jesus, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you wicked men, you nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. So who put Jesus on the cross? How do you answer that question biblically? Well, wicked men put him there, right? Indeed they did. But goodness, is that the only answer we give? How about God so loved the world that he gave his only son? How about that answer? Who put Christ on that cross? God did. Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So who put Christ on the cross? Wicked men did. God did. Okay, so dual agency, they go together. Now the question is, does one have ultimacy? Delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed him to the cross by the hands of wicked men. Can you hear ultimacy there? Primacy to one side or the other? Clearly, God has ultimacy. They carry out what he predetermined they do. Even stronger is in chapter 4, verses 27 and 28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel. Now look at this last phrase. To do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. And this is a powerful passage because it indicates individuals and groups of people. So it indicates Herod, Pontius Pilate. So these individual men and what they did they do it freely? Did they do what they wanted to do? Did they make choices out of their own natures? Yes, they did. But did they not fulfill what God predetermined they do? Indeed they did. So the two go together. Which one has ultimacy? God's action. So human agency, divine agency, going together with individuals and with groups of people. Gentiles, the Romans, the soldiers, the peoples of Israel, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law that cried out, crucify him, were fulfilling what God's purpose predestined to occur. Wow, amazing. Okay, compatibilistic action then is action that involves human agency, divine agency. They go together. You have to give two answers to questions like, who put Jesus on the cross? Wicked men did, God did, and God's agency is primary, is the ultimate explanation for what happens. All right, let's move ahead now to the other handout. And now at Roman numeral 3. Roman numeral 3. Reformed understanding of divine providence, the nature of God's relation to the world. And here I just want to make a basic statement, and then we'll unpack some other parts of this. God created a world over which God exercises complete regulative control of all things, including all events in nature, as well as all choices and actions of his moral creatures. So in contrast to the Arminian and open theist models, where they say, notice the difference, they say God puts natural law in place, and so he's hands-off, basically, for the most part. I mean, he can intervene if he wants to, but he rarely does. He's hands-off in regard to nature, and he gives to human beings libertarian freedom. So he is, for the most part, hands-off in regard to what we do. The Reformed model instead says, yes, God puts natural law in place, and yes, he does give freedom to creatures, but he regulates everything that takes place. So nothing takes place in nature. Nothing takes place in human affairs that does not accord with God's ordained will. Everything happens according to God's own decree, or his ordination, or his purpose. Remember in Ephesians 1:11, we've received an inheritance, having been predestined according to his purpose, who works how much? All things after the counsel of his will. Amazing. Capital letter B. Providence in relation to human free choices and actions. And here the Reformed model proposes a different conception of freedom from the libertarian notion. We are created, according to Reformed people, as moral creatures possessing a freedom of inclination which is compatible with God's sovereign control. Hence, it is sometimes called compatibilist freedom. Freedom of inclination rather than libertarian freedom. Okay? Now, what is freedom of inclination? And then I'm going to show you the contrast between the two. Freedom of inclination, look at the definition that is there in your handout. Freedom of inclination can be defined this way. We are free in choosing one thing. If all things being just what they are when we make our choice, we are unconstrained and uncoerced so that we choose according to our strongest inclination, or our highest desire, or simply what we most want. So it's a very simple concept, and that is we're free in making a choice if, when we make that choice, all things being just what they are, we do what we most want. We act according to our highest inclination. Now, the word most want and highest inclination is important, because what this does not say is that when we make a choice, it's the only choice we want. No. I mean, think of the dieter. Sorry, it's a terrible example, I know, for many of us, myself included. Think of the dieter standing before the dessert table, you know? I mean, does the dieter have conflicting desires? You bet he does. She does. I mean, you bet. You bet. Because, boy, on the one hand, wow, there's my favorite dessert. What a horrible example to give with Thanksgiving coming up, isn't it? You know? Terrible. Pecan pie. I love pecan pie. I know we're going to have it for Thanksgiving. So I mean, here is this array of wonderful things. And you can have competing desires. You can have competing desires over, which dessert would I rather take? And then add to that, should I have any at all? Because I'm on this diet, right? So you can have all these competing desires. You are free, all things considered, when you do what you most want, and you are unconstrained in so doing. So whatever it is you most want, that's what you're going to do. Now, that doesn't mean there are not other desires. In fact, you might even say to somebody, boy, I really wanted that piece of chocolate cake, but I didn't take it. Which is true, you did really want it. But guess what? You really wanted something more, namely, not to take it. Otherwise, you would have taken it, right? So your highest desire, your strongest inclination is what you act on. And by the way, when you see this is the kind of freedom we have. It is enormously illuminating in regard to sanctification. Why? For this very simple reason. We always do what we most want. When we sin, when we yield to temptation, guess what we do? We do what we most want. So what has to happen is there has to be a work of the Spirit and the Word in our hearts to reshape our most want-tos. Right? So we now most want to resist that temptation and follow in the ways of the Lord. That becomes our new highest desire, most want. Does that mean that we don't have any desire any longer toward those other things that are sinful? Just like the dieter who keeps on his diet. That doesn't mean he doesn't look at that dessert table and go, wow, that looks great. Oh, I would love to take a piece of that chocolate cake. But my highest desire is I'm going to stay on this diet. I am committed to doing that. So he walks away. So yes, you can have desires for those other things. The question is, what is your highest desire? And so bringing into your life, feeding your soul, feeding your mind and your heart truth that will give to you reason for having as your highest desire that which pleases God is a huge part of sanctification. That really is the whole purpose of the ministry of the Word, is to work within us to give us reason for having as our highest desire what is right and good and holy and just and merciful and all, so that we act as God would act. Okay. Now, why is this conception of freedom of inclination, preferred by Reformed people over libertarian freedom? Okay, track with me here, folks. Are you with me? Okay. I mean, we're covering a lot of stuff here on this last morning. But try to follow. This is very important. Why do Reformed people commend freedom of inclination over libertarian freedom? Well, there really are two main reasons. The first one is a philosophical reason. That is, they are convinced that libertarian freedom does not account for why we do what we do. It is bankrupt in accounting for why we do what we do. What was libertarian freedom again? Well, when we make a choice, if we're free according to libertarian freedom, all things being just what they are, we could do this or that, right? Now here's the problem with that. That is, we have the power of contrary choice. If we choose A, we could have chosen B. Here's the problem with that. If when I choose A, all things being just what they are, I could just as well have chosen B, then tell me, why did I choose A over B? Why choose B over A? If any reason you give for why you choose A is the identical reason or set of reasons for why instead you choose B, what explains A over B or B over A? And the answer is nothing does. So our freedom then becomes, our actions then become arbitrary. They become capricious. Reformed people call libertarian freedom a freedom of indifference. Can you see why? Freedom of indifference. Because really, you have to be indifferent to A or B, because at the moment of the choice, all things being just what they are, you could choose A or B, then there is no reason for choosing A over B or B over A, hence you have to be indifferent to them. But we know that's not the case. We know we actually choose A over B because we want A more, or we choose B over A because we want B more. Hence, freedom of inclination, not freedom of indifference or libertarian freedom. So the first reason that Reformed people reject libertarian freedom is that on analysis, even though it seems intuitively right when you first hear it, what's freedom? Oh, well, it's simply a power of contrary choice. And when you choose A, you could have chosen B. Most people hearing that go, well, of course, that's got to be freedom. That makes perfect sense. On analysis, you realize it doesn't work. It doesn't explain why we make the choices we do. What explains why we make the choices we do is we do what we most want. I mean, isn't this what a court of law would seek to establish in regard to a crime committed? Motive. Why did he do this? What led him to do this? Well, what are they seeking to establish? What led to him having as his highest desire committing the crime? Motive. So freedom of inclination then is bankrupt in terms of its ability to actually explain why we choose the way we do. Here's the second reason that Reformed people reject libertarian freedom and favor freedom